Hey everybody, welcome to the first ever Identity Jedi Show. So glad that you are tuned in and that you're able to make this. This is coming to you live on LinkedIn and also exclusively on the ebonyascent.com platform. So, man, welcome. Welcome my young Identity Jedis in training. Look, we're going to keep this branded until you know what, or you know who tries to come after me for it, but we'll be all right. I am so glad to kick this off. This has been something that I have been thinking about for the past couple of months. And for those of you that have followed my other podcast for a while, my other endeavors, Cocktails, Code, and Conversation, you know that I started that podcast out, really deep into tech, right? Obviously interviewing different people from within my network that have been in the tech field, asking them different questions, understanding identity. And then as I started to kind of shift the narrative on that podcast, I didn't want to lose the technical talk. I still wanted to be able to nerd out about identity and the things. And so I said, you know what, let's go ahead and separate the two. For the C3 squad, for the part of the C3 squad that started following me that loves identity, this is now your chance. This is where I will be posting and nerding out on all the things about identity. So thank you for rocking with me as long as you have. Welcome to the new format, new show. It's the same host, same thing. Now we're really going to be focused on identity. And the way this show is going to come, it's going to be coming at you every month, right? Live on LinkedIn. So make sure you're following me on LinkedIn and then, tune in. We're nailing down the time, right? I think right now we like this time slot, in the evening so people can kind of get through their day. And we're going to do it on a Monday because, of course, we got to be the best thing about your Monday. So we'll play with that. We'll see how things go, but it will be once a month. It will be on the 25th going forward. So just go ahead, mark it in your calendar right now. Every 25th of the month, the Identity Jedi Show will be coming at you with all the things going in identity. And we'll be talking about news. I'll be having different interviews with experts from around the world. And then we're going to be doing a little bit of training, right? Giving you some tips and tricks and some things within identity, things that I've learned of my career, things that some friends of mine and some experts that I know will be breaking down and helping you. So for those of you who are looking at this and like, hey, I'm thinking about getting into identity, or I want to learn more about how to do certain things, got you covered as well. So that's the format. That's it. Let's get to it. Let's get this thing started and let's jump to the news. What's been going on in identity? All right, so it has been a very, very interesting year in the world of identity. We've had a lot of kind of big things coming, and this segment I'm going to take a little bit more time, longer than probably I normally would, just because it's the first one, and there's a lot of things to kind of cover. Obviously with this year, we've seen a turn in the market. We're starting to see things kind of tighten up. So we've seen a lot of just tech in general just kind of get hit from a valuation standpoint. People trying to change the way they do things, but specifically in identity and access management, we've been seeing this trend over the last 3 or 4 years of consolidation. Right, we're starting to really look at kind of repeat some of the things we saw from the late 90s, early 2000s, to where we want one stack. Right, customers are really asking for that, and they've gotten used to SaaS. They get it, but I think they're starting to tire of these big, huge integration projects that come on with identity. Right, I've got to buy X project and B, or X product and B product and A product. Then I got to integrate them all together. So then I got to pay, Y consulting group to come and do all this, and it's so expensive. Why, when everything can be SaaS now, right? And so I do believe that in the next, I'm going to say about 2 years, we're going to see the true IDaaS player, kind of take hold in this space. We've seen some shots, some early warnings of that already. Okta came out last year and announced that they were going to be getting into IGA and PAM as well, and they were actually supposed to be launching that this year. We've yet to see anything around that, but I do expect they put out a really good vision around their product, so I do expect that to be coming. And we've seen some consolidation on other ends. CyberArk has snapped up some things. We've seen PAM vendors kind of consolidate, and so I do think we're leaning towards that of one, kind of IDaaS solution to rule them all. This is something that we looked at, like I said, late 90s, early 2000s. You look something like Oracle, who was going and snapping up every single identity technology you could think of. Of course, I don't think their plan was to dominate the identity space, but it just so happened that a lot of the big identity players ended up all under Oracle, and that didn't turn out the way we wanted to. I think it was more technology and timing than anything else. But we are kind of starting to see that now. And I'm interested to see how it's going to come together. Another big thing that's coming out is authorization. I'm really seeing a rise in authorization companies as we're starting to kind of put our focus over there. Zero trust obviously is now, more than a buzzword. It's kind of just a thing. We get it, right? As people are actually getting into the implementation mode of this and trying to implement these zero trust architectures, it means I got to be able to authenticate and authorize dynamically and fine grain at all times, right? I can't just give somebody a credential and say, okay, you've got access to this role or you've got access to this group. knock yourself out, right? I need to be able to interrogate and ask that digital identity constantly, who they are, prove who they are, and understand based on the context, if they still need authorization, how much authorization do they need? And to be able to do those things, right, we've got to get a lot more fine grained in the authorization and a lot more dynamic in the authorization than we've seen before. So starting to see that pop up a lot. And actually, as we get into some of the interviews that I've done, you'll kind of hear that, right? And it actually wasn't even planned, just, kind of talking to different people that wanted to come onto the show and talk about identity. And you start to see that, it's becoming a theme. And it's exciting. Some of us that have been around in identity for a while, because it's an area that, has always kind of often been, I don't want to say ignored, but just it was lower on the priority. And I think now when we look at the timing of things, we look at how we're trying to build these architectures, it becomes a lot more important. So it's been a thing there that I'm going to be interested in, keep my eye on. There's a lot of companies and startups out there that are starting to look into that realm. So other things in the news, SellPoint, right? SellPoint's had a big year, right? Two big things. Number one, most recently, their rebrand, right? So SellPoint rebranded, new corporate website, new logos, new colors, which is actually kind of nice, right? I can be a little bit of a, old school, right? SellPoint's still near and dear in my heart. I was there for 6.5 years, and it was great to still have good friends there. But I like where they're going, right? Definitely a modern, kind of cleaner look to their new brand, and it actually comes on the tail of an acquisition for them. So Thoma Bravo came back and took them private, right? So SellPoint went from being a public company now to a private company back with Thoma Bravo. For those of you that know, Thoma Bravo originally brought SellPoint back as a PE firm and then took them public, and now going back private. So big things, right? That's a pretty big shockwave throughout the identity industry. SellPoint now is the undisputed leader in identity governance and administration. So it's going to be interesting to see what their future looks like going forward and some of the things that they're going to do now. But from the rebrand, I like it. Identity Jedi approved, like the new colors. It's going to be interesting to see where they go. Had a pretty rough year on the other side of that, right? So they kicked off the year with a data breach, unfortunately, and that just, obviously anything with data breaches caused a lot of ruffling of the feathers and things. A lot of news cycles about that. Market turns, and their stock has been just taking a pretty bad hit. But I would say if we've got Okta friends and buddies out there, give them a hug. Right now's not the time to pile on. Breaches. Unfortunately, breaches do happen. It's one of those things that, a buddy of mine, Richard Bird, would say, it's horrible that we're in this sense. Like, it's not about, if it's going to happen, it's when. And it shouldn't be that way, but it is kind of the thing, right? So, and I think as an identity community, as we start to realize that, we've known for a while that identity and access management controls are, one of the tools that are the most sensitive and should be the most protected. And as we have leaned into that identity being at the core of security, I think we're going to start seeing this more and more as the attackers start to pay attention to the identity tools that are within our space. So, it's up to us to support our brothers and sisters, because, we're all going to be going through it at some point in time. So, let's look into that. And Okta's been recovering and doing the things they're supposed to do. And then recently, Optimize, I did a blog, and it's actually a really in-depth blog. I like it a lot. I'm going to link it here and show you guys the write-up on it. But Optimize, and doing their research on identity and access management, tools and security, found some configurations that can lead to some leaking of passwords and clear text, things and other things that are kind of less secure. So definitely check out the blog. I'll post it there. I'll post on the Ebony Ascent newsletter that goes with the Jedi episode. But I would highly recommend you checking that out. I think Optimize did a really good job of kind of getting into details and kind of showing exactly what it is. And of course, they were responsible, research led. They did reach out to Okta first and kind of let them know about it. And they talk about that in the blog. And I think, this is the type of things that I think we should start adopting within the identity community, right? We see it with traditional security companies all the time. They have research labs, things like that. They reach out, let people know what's going on. I think this is awesome, right? We all get better together, right? Let's not look at it as an adversarial thing, right? There's plenty, there's plenty of customers that need all of our services and help. And so I think the more that we, challenge each other and work with each other, that at the end of the day, we do what we want to do is make our products better for our customers. So that was actually, pretty cool to see. Probably not the greatest thing that, for a company, if you want that out there, but again, they did not work with Okta. So I do suggest that you go check out the blog, read it. It's pretty in-depth. And then check out Optimize. They're actually doing some really good things. It's interesting to see their take on things as they're moving towards a more, how do I want to say this? Not to put words in their marketer's mouth, but what I'm liking about the product and tool that I've seen is they're really diving into like what goes beyond the access that you've given, right? So one of the things, for us that have been in identity for a long time is we manage things up to the entitlement, meaning I can see that you have this role or I've given you this group. and then that's it. But we don't know what's beyond that, right? We haven't done a great job in our tools of knowing, well, what does that group actually give you access to? What things can you get with that? And Optimize does a great job of actually showing you that. And obviously they've got the ability to do access reviews and certifications of that nature. But I think the biggest thing is that visibility into those relationships and connections. And you're gonna kind of hear that in some of my guests as a theme there, is that is a way that we would like identity to go, because we've handled what I call the front door of who are you and what should you have access to, and how do we govern that entire process and automate that process and make sure we're putting correct policies in place that you don't have access to things that you're not supposed to. So we've got that at the front door, but now it's kind of digging into that. Once we've made it through the front door, now let's dig into really what this organization is and the relationships of how this access gets you, how this access grants you different things within the organization, and the speed at which this is happening. And when we're walking into this world of things such as cloud services and automation, things spin up and get access without us knowing. It's usually not always just human identities that need this access. We've got bots, we've got scripts, we've got Lambda functions that run, that we've got containers that stand up, infrastructure that stands up, needs access, does something, and then shuts back down. Understanding the connections to all those resources that you're granting access to is going to be critical as we start to expand more and more identities within our spaces. So it's interesting to see this kind of format finally taking place, where you're seeing kind of more graph style versions of access and being able to look at it, which I believe is important. It's something that personally I've wanted to see the identity industry move to, and we're starting to see some of that. So that's pretty cool. So that's what we got. That's the news. If you hear things, more topics, news, please feel free, reach out, send it to me. You can reach out to me, info@onthecorner.us. You can send me articles. You can send me, anything that you see that you're like, hey, I want to get your take on this. Also, you can, if you want to be on the show, you want to be a guest on the show and then talk about some things, send it on over. Send me an email, info@onthecorner.us. And obviously, if you're watching this on LinkedIn, you can just get at me on LinkedIn, send me a DM, and we can talk about it and get you on the show or talk about some of the topics you want to talk about. So that's it for the news. So with that, we're going to pass it over to our interview. Today's guest is Mr. Brad Tumy. Brad and I have known each other for a while. We've been in, kind of the circles. He was actually an original guest back on my C3 podcast, and he's coming back on to talk about some of the cool things that he's got going on right now. So with that, let's get you over to the interview. See you guys in a minute. All right, everybody, welcome to the Identity Jedi Show. And we have our special guest, our very first special guest on the Identity Jedi Show, Mr. Brad Tumy. Thank you, sir.
Hey there. How's it going, David?
It's going good, man. So Brad and I, this is our first rodeo doing this. It was actually on the C3 podcast in season 2, I believe, if I'm recalling correctly. So when I decided to kind of do the Identity Jedi Show, I was like, you know what? It's going to be all about identity. Got to get Brad to come back on, because he's got some cool stuff he's working on.
Oh,
and
yeah.
What better person to kick off the inaugural show and just kind of talk about identity and what he's excited about going forward than Brad Tumy. So thanks for taking the time, sir.
No, thanks for having me, David. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, so for those uninitiated that don't know the infamous Brad Tumy, tell everybody a little bit about yourself and how you got into identity.
Oh, yeah. So a classic story. As you spend any time in the identity space, you hear the same story of, I kind of stumbled into identity. Very few people set out with the intention of going into, well, maybe in the past, very few people set out to, they just sort of ended up there as the space evolved. But I started out in application development. And because of the nature of, I live near Washington, D.C., so there were a lot of federal projects, which led to a lot of like national security projects. Yeah. So working in the security space kind of just ended up in identity about 20 years ago, and just have worked with a number of different vendors, ForgeRock and Oracle, and now more recently with IndyKite. So it's just kind of progressed from doing development to doing implementation to doing architecture and design, and sort of completing the wheel or the evolution there, and sort of I don't want to say necessarily getting back into development, but spending a lot more time writing code these days, which has been really interesting. It's been a long time. I sort of thought I'd hung up that hat, but it's been a lot of fun over the last year.
What are you writing in?
Actually, it's all been JavaScript, a little bit of Go.
Okay.
So just kind of, I'll just go ahead and start talking about IndyKite, I'll let the cat out of the bag. So I started working with a new vendor in the identity space, IndyKite. The focus there is all about the developer experience, building tools for developers, sort of not to be cliche, but tools for developers by developers.
Right.
So a lot of my work initially my role was building the developer community, and I've recently switched over to a senior solutions engineering role. But my role day to day is sort of taking the work that the engineering team is doing, the SDKs, the administrative console, and just sort of proving everything out from a customer perspective and doing implementations from a customer's perspective. So really getting down into the weeds with using the SDK. I'll finally answer your question, but most of my work has been in JavaScript with Node, or in Node, using the Node framework. A lot of React, a little bit of Python. We've got some developers working in Python SDK as well, but most of my work has been on the JavaScript side.
Cool. Python just doesn't go away, man.
Yeah, no, it never will. It's great. It's a great programming language.
Yeah, for those of you new to the identity space, right? You will soon come to find that Python will be the bane of your existence. Learn it now. Learn it, get used to it, especially if you're on the implementation side, right? Mm-hmm. Or the vendor side or consulting side, and you're coming in and trying to help customers, like, change over their identity systems, things like that. You're going to find Python everywhere. It just, it's one of those, it's just one of those tools, right? It's easy to kind of pick up. You can do a lot with it from a scripting perspective. So anytime you have to kind of talk to different systems or do kind of batch jobs, Python just makes it super easy. So
it's a perfect glue code. Yep. So the gaps in between what the vendors provide and the gaps, with the kind of what you need to do when you're on site and in the trenches, Python always comes through.
Yep, there you go. So there you go. Pro tip, ladies and gentlemen, if you're watching, you're thinking, I want to get into identity, what should I learn? Python. All right, so Brad, talk to us about IndyKite, man. I am excited. I've been wanting to ask and hear about what's going on there. I've seen a lot of interesting, like, new players coming into the identity field. So yeah, excited to hear about them. So yeah, and especially with your little teaser, built for developers by developers, I think it's pretty cool.
Yeah. So IndyKite. So if you're familiar with our founder, Anderson from FordRock, and prior to that, Sun, while at FordRock, started identifying really in the authorization space. The current vendors were kind of limited to, if you're a member of this group, you can do X, or you can do Y, you can do Z. If you're not a member of the group, you can't do X, you can't do Y, you can't do Z. I just found it very limiting. And so between role-based access control and attribute-based access control, it just kind of, customers were hitting the wall with what they needed to do. And one of the projects they started looking at, or they started working on, was what if instead of an LDAP directory on the back end, we used a graph database? And that opened up an entirely new world of things that you could do, not just in authorization, although that's sort of the key area that we're playing in, or that we're building to. But what we found is that so with using graph database modeling, you can graph in real world. So you're not creating a model. Basically, you're not going to customers saying, well, as long as your model or your business fits into the LDAP model or to the directories model, we can, and we could put it into a database and have a relationship. Can't even remember my terminology anymore. It's been so long since I've worked at Oracle. A relational table. So what we found is that with the graph model, you can build the database to look exactly like the customer's business. And I mean, like, one for one, perfect map. Go to a whiteboard and you draw circles and lines on the board, and you're putting this all together. That's exactly how the database looks when you implement it. So really the key there, it becomes not just the nodes, not just the objects, but the relationship between the objects. So maybe you're granted permission through this, the edge between the two nodes. You're granted permission for a role, maybe you're granted permission to a document, maybe you're granted permission to a car, or it's endless. Whatever the object is or the resource is, you can get access to it, or you can own it, or you can modify it, or you can do whatever. As that graph database technology matures and you add AI to it, you add machine learning to it, you find that, well, it's not just the relationship between it, but as you're collecting that data, you're feeding that back into the model, or you're feeding that back into the graph, and you're expanding and you're enriching the data that's there. So you have this extensive set of metadata. Well, you can now use that along with the relationships to define really interesting policies, authorization policies, access policies. But it doesn't end just with access, it doesn't end with authorization. We're actually finding that customers are able to establish new lines of business or new services with the data that's coming out of this graph. And so they're able to turn around and say, well, wait a second, I can monetize my identity data, and not in the traditional way of I'm going to just sell your data. It's or the scammy way of I've collected all of your data and now I'm going to sell it. It's I can monetize it because now that I know what you're related to, I know what your transactions are, I know kind of this common path that you're taking through the graph. I can offer you relevant services because now I'm looking at the graph. I know exactly what your needs are. I know exactly what you're doing or what you've done. So it really it's really exciting that we can, that's one of our the value add talking points when we talk to customers. We're like, yeah, we do identity. Of course we do. We're an identity company, but if you look at this data and you begin enriching this data, could it open up another line of service, or could it open up another opportunity for you that you maybe hadn't thought of before?
That is fantastic.
Yeah.
And I say that because it's always been, right, man, I have always been on this side of like, how can we get business to look at identity as a revenue generator, right? Instead of
Exactly.
like always had to come with the security and insurance model, right? You got to do this because you don't want this to happen, and stuff. And it's like, what you're talking about, what you guys sounds like a development with IndyKite is the ability to, really show that data and go like, here's how it can be useful, right? It's answering questions. I mean, that's the whole AI and machine learning part of it, right? Answering questions about data that you can use to say how to make this more useful, like within your business. And the fact that it's identity data behind it is fantastic. And it's interesting to hear about the graph, the graph DB model. It's something, the relationships of data, like how you access something or how you have access to something, right? I think it's something in identity that we've never really gotten right. We've never really looked at. We just did oh, you have this role, you have this group. Great.
Right.
What the heck does that group do? What is it connected to? How does that represent my digital identity and the breadth of access that I didn't get? And I'm starting to see, more companies, do that. Shout out to Optimize. I've been, working with them a little bit. They've got a great visibility tool into that as well to kind of see the connections that your access has. And so I'm happy to hear, at IndyKite, you guys are, again, same thing, looking at the real relationships, right? We're, I think we're going to be entering this realm of the new RBAC, which is really just relationship-based access, right? It's how
totally agree. Yeah, and I think what's exciting, as a startup, you look around and the worst thing that could happen is nobody else is doing this, right? Because you're like, okay, we're either way early or we're way wrong.
Right.
But the fact that, like you said, there are other vendors that are doing this, that are other vendors in this space, really, I think it tells us that we're onto something. It tells us, hey, this is the right approach. And honestly, the feedback as we talk to customers and potential customers, the feedback is like, you kind of have this, they're like, oh, wait a second. And then the light bulb goes off. They're like, oh, but can we do this, can we, what about this? What about this use case? Like, yeah, absolutely. We can do it. And the cool thing about the way IndyKite's doing this is that the database, the backend services, all of that we're delivering that in a SaaS model. So it's cloud-based, it's available. And then from a developer perspective, you're like, okay, well, how do I integrate this? How do I make this mine, or how do I use it? Well, we have SDKs, and you just, you add that to your application, and you very, very easily add that functionality through through the use of the SDK. So I think that's what, when Lhasa called about a year and a half ago and was like, "Hey, this is what we're doing. Are you interested?" And it was, oh, I mean, to be honest, if Lawson called and said, I'm going to sell ice cream, I would have been like, "Yeah, let's go do it." But the fact that the story was so compelling, the fact that it was so well thought out from the, we're going to build this as tools, in the form of an SDK or the form of SDKs that developers can use. And the cool part about it is that they want to open source a lot of it, or if not all of it. So like authentication, actually giving away authentication for free. So not that I don't want to turn this to a sales pitch, but it's cool that we're, you have to implement authentication. You
Right.
have to provide that. But the idea, or one of the things that we don't necessarily want everyone to have to do a lift and shift or a lift and replace. Like if you're using Okta for authentication, cool, keep using Okta for authentication. Let us come in and help you with authorization. Let us come in and help you with these other areas.
Right.
And how do we, the data that you've been collecting through Okta or Ping or whoever, okay, now can we help you use that data, and maybe turn it into a revenue source instead of just a kind of a risk,
Right.
a risk.
In a world where identity and access was absolute chaos, one organization rose from amongst the fray to bring order and justice to the world, and also help others learn the ways of identity. Check out idpro.org to learn more and become a member today.
So you have your developers, they've got the SDK. What kind of tying it does it have back to like the central identity teams that they can kind of see and what the developers are doing, or any kind of bridge there that allows for the identity team to be working with the devs?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's at least two, traditional kind of storyboarding. There's two personas. There's the developer, and then there's the sysadmin or the IAM team. And
Right.
what we envision is that the IAM team is managing sort of all of the common elements, like the setup, like the authentication flows, the authorization policies, anything that would be common across elements. And then they can delegate some of the administration out to a dev team. So here's an application agent, or the credential file that you need for your application. Definitely we'll definitely have evolution in the tooling that's there. So what kind of monitoring or what kind of statistics can you get for from the individual? Okay, we know that this from this credential file or this agent, this is the traffic we're seeing. That'll all come, but right now we're focusing more on the kind of the bigger blocks.
Yeah.
And getting those all in place. But that's definitely the goal to be able to get to that point.
Awesome. So, my second question, I think, was kind of answered the first, right? Coming into IndyKite. But like, other than what you got going on with IndyKite, is there anything else when you look at the identity industry that has you excited, right? I feel like we're in our third wave here with identity, right? We've matured, we've grown up, we've done a lot of things. So kind of looking forward, right? What are some trends that you see coming that you're excited about?
Oh, I mean, zero trust is very exciting. That sounds kind of like the stock corporate answer, right? I'm very excited about audits. I think zero trust, especially with the adoption in the federal government here in the U.S., it's just like people. It's like they're starting to get it. Like they're starting to get that these traditional, we've authenticated the user once a day, and that's good enough, and everything's good. I mean, the nature of remote work, the nature of mobile work, the nature of IoT, we've talked to customers who their users are not people. They're machines on a manufacturing floor, or they're machines out, a couple, 100 miles out in offshore on a platform.
Right.
It's not people that are logging in; it's machines. And can those be compromised, or how do you do multi-factor authentication for a bot? Well, that's still a problem that needs to be solved. So how do you get that higher assurance level, or that higher security with a non-person entity? So getting into zero trust and having that model where people are saying, okay, we've given them access, but the context is changing, the location's changing. How do we give the same level of service? that's really the key. It's always been in our space, in the security space, there's always been that trade-off between, do we make it more secure, or do we make it easier to use? And I think what we're after, I know the frequent conversation at IndyKite is high security, low friction, because you want to be able to give the access, when needed, but you also want to be able to just the right amount of friction,
right?
So that okay, we can trust this. This is good. Okay, they're transferring $1 million. Are we good with this? Yeah, okay. Because we've been paying attention to the different factors in this user's session, so that I think hands down is probably the most exciting. But once getting into self-sovereign, decentralized, that's exciting. I mean, from a personal level, as a consumer myself, it's exciting because, our data is everywhere. And, I mean, I'm probably now getting 20 texts a day where, oh, you're pre-approved for a loan. And I'm like, oh, good grief. Someone sold my data again. So being able to take back control of that and only giving like the minimal level of access that's needed to people, the vendors that are asking for it. And, I can say, well, just use this profile that I created over here, but, only share my email address, or only share, you know what, don't even tell them my age, just tell them that I am over 21, things like that. I mean, I think that was the holy grail that we talked about 20 years ago. True authorization, or the kind of where we're heading is, I don't want to give you my data and have you decide whether I pass the test or not. I want like, you ask me the question and I'll tell you true or false, or I'll tell you yes or no, or it's not me telling you, but it's, a verifier.
Yeah.
Will say, yes, the Motor Vehicle Administration, yes, he's 21. My bank, yes, he does have, that credit. Things like that. I think those areas are really what has me excited.
Yeah, it is definitely. I've been delving into the Web3 on my own. Like I like the conversations that are happening there, right? Yeah. And I like where we are with, I will be honest, I would first admit when, the first mention of like identity and blockchain that happened, I was like, oh my God, here we go. Grab a technology and say it's this, that, or whatever. But when I started researching and even now looking at Web3 and how it's built, the decentralized nature of it, I was like, this could be powerful, right? How we could build and share and verify attributes. And so I think about it from an identity perspective of what we could do with that. And, how it turns how we build applications, how we interact with applications, truly if, users are bringing their own identity that we have to verify, then what does that look like? So I'm interested to see how that changes over the next couple of years. I think we're right on the precipice because the technology is starting to, not that it's catching up, but I think it's starting to get stable enough to where we can start to actually really see the business use cases, right? The business is always behind technology, right? We create this stuff in a lab somewhere and we say, oh, it's really cool in business settings. I have no clue how to make any money off of it, right? So we're starting to realize how we can make money off of it, which means adoption. So
yeah, well, I think the key word that you just said it is the verified data, and being able to, sure, I can tell you who I am and I can tell you these things, but adding that level of assurance so that when I present to you my data, you can say, well, okay, is this verified with somebody else? Is this verified with a trusted provider?
Right.
And I think that's really where it gets interesting because, excuse me, if I'm a service provider, I'm providing services and you're bringing me data, well, okay, how much money can I loan you, or how much, what things can I offer you when I don't have verified data?
Right.
Like take an insurance company, they want to offer different levels of insurance and they want to offer different packages to different people, but it's like, they're looking at okay, you told me what your income level is, you told me what this is, but it's hard to verify. It's hard to digitally verify that information. Right. And as a consumer, we're used to, okay, well, you fill out these 15 pages, take a couple of weeks and we'll review it. We'll have our independent person go and review it and prove it and verify it. And in 3 or 4 months, we'll talk. But now we can do this all electronically. We can do this all digitally. and that verification happens in real time or, within a few seconds, that's a game changer for companies that want to offer additional services or want to offer more compelling packages. So while it's really great from a personal privacy perspective, I think it really interesting from those companies that are doing business that, okay, now that I've verified this, with this independent party, okay, now, now we're talking a different situation, and now we can, and I'm being intentionally vague here or generic, but now we can offer this more elaborate service or this higher tier service because we know for a fact your income level. We know for a fact you have a safe driving record. We know for a fact.
Yep.
And it's coming from a higher, trusted verifier.
Absolutely. Fun times ahead.
Oh, for sure.
Right. All right. Well, Brad, that's all the time we have. I appreciate you, coming in again. It's always fun talking to you. And for those of you that would want to join in on conversations like this, obviously you can always watch the Identity Jedi Show, but got to give a shout out, ID Pro. Look, people are going to watch this and think like, is he just doing this just ID Pro? But no, it's just because it's a great organization. And, people like myself, Brad, Justin Richer, who you'll hear from, and so much more. Sarah Cicchetti, Ian Glazer, they're all hanging out at ID Pro. For the Slack channel alone, I'm telling you people, you want to go ahead and get your membership because that's where we all are. We're all hanging out in the Slack, having these conversations. And so as we continue to grow the identity field, I wanted this to be a place where you can come and hear from the experts, but also make sure you check out ID Pro, sign up. The Body of Knowledge as well. Great place if you're looking to get started in identity. There's articles written by all the experts, right? Including Brad. Have you written an article? I haven't written one yet.
I have not.
I've reviewed a couple. I just haven't written one at some point. I'll write one.
I just looked through the other day. There was a lot of really kind of getting started and very well organized, very well put together.
Awesome. Big shout out again to Brad Tumy for coming on and being one of the first to be interviewed on the Identity Jedi Show. Always a good time catching up with him and chatting and nerding out. Like I said, this is what the show is all about. Love getting into identity topics and discussions. So now we are going to jump into my favorite part, Identity Jedi training. We're going to get into some training. We're going to talk about some things, give you some tips and tricks, and do some deep dives in some different areas in identity. And so when I was thinking about this, when I was thinking about this segment, I was like, all right, there's definitely some topics I got to cover. One of them was definitely OAuth, right? It's something that I think is talked about a lot, it's covered a lot, but it's used so much, and there's so many different things to it that I thought it was the perfect one to kind of dive into. And of course, I was like, what better person, right, to talk about OAuth than the man himself, Mr. Justin Richer. So, we had to come out of the gate strong. So for the first Identity Jedi training, we've got none other than our guy, Justin Richer, Mr. OAuth himself. So with that, here we go. Jedi training time. All right, everybody, as we continue with the Identity Jedi Show, we are now getting into my favorite portion, which is Jedi training. So each week or each month, actually, as we go into this, we're going to dive into a topic and kind of give you some details about a specific area of identity. And so this month's session is going over OAuth. And of course, look, you can't talk about OAuth. You can't even Google the words OAuth and not come up with my man, Justin Richer. So we had him come on the show today, and we're going to dive into some topics about OAuth. So Justin, thanks for taking some time and coming in and chatting about OAuth with us in the audience.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to this.
All right. So the way we want to kind of go after this, if somebody's listening to this, they're watching in this, and they're just now kind of getting into it, right? Saying, all right, I've been hearing about this OAuth thing everywhere. I Google it. I got pages from Okta. I got pages from this. Let's give them like a brief intro. So kind of like, what is OAuth, why it exists? And then from your perspective, 3 or 4 things where it's like, okay, if I was starting today, knowing everything you know about it, where should they start and how should they go about, kind of building OAuth the right way?
Absolutely. So I think it's important to start with what OAuth is as a protocol, because a lot of times people look at it and say, oh, OAuth is what I use to log into Google or log into Facebook, or it's something that I authorize my systems using. But fundamentally, OAuth really is not an authentication or authorization protocol. OAuth is, in fact, actually fundamentally a delegation protocol. And the whole idea is that you are delegating some right of access that you have to a piece of software that you want to work on your behalf. So let's say that I've got an application that I need to go and access data that I have stored on a cloud system. Traditionally, what people would have to do is give the username and password to that application and then have the application pretend to be the user. Just log in as that user calling the API. OAuth allows you to delegate that access to say this application can go use that API without having to pretend to be me, which means that I can now make sure that that application has less access than my entire account would have, or I could time limit it, or say you can only make 5 calls, or any number of other limitations that I can do. And importantly, I can cut off access to it without ever having to change my password because I've never exposed my password or anything else. Additionally, in today's world, you start getting into accounts where things are protected with multi-factor authentication, which if you're not doing that, you should be, or using federated login systems. And these are systems where you log in without using a password, or at least not just a password. And so in those kinds of cases, there's really nothing that I could give an application to pretend to be me. So I need to have a protocol that allows me to actually grant that kind of access to it in order for it to do any kind of work for me. And interestingly, like I said a minute ago, OAuth gets seen a lot as an identity protocol. That's how people think of it and use it.
Right.
What's really happening there, though, is that OAuth is still acting as a delegation protocol, but what's being delegated is the right to know who I am.
Right.
So I can go to an application and say, I am going to give you access to a very special API that tells you my identity. And so OAuth is really just a small building block to that whole login process. In order to actually do the login, you need a higher level protocol such as OpenID Connect, which builds directly on top of OAuth in order to convey that additional information about who you are.
Right. And, you know, I think this is not, but this is really important with how we develop applications today, right? You know, it is in this API first kind of driven world where every application is now is created to talk to another application, right? And a lot of the things that you interact with now from an application perspective, the functionality that you see is usually provided by a bunch of different applications in the background, right? So when you log into one application, you do need to access all these other applications. And so, you know, it's OAuth and, to your point, OIDC collecting the actual first authentication point that's allowing a lot of these things to happen. So understanding how this works is important both for application developers, but especially for, you know, identity practitioners as you're coming up, as you're looking to figure out ways to, you know, secure these applications and keep them within your environment and understand, you know, where access is being granted and given, you know, understanding how these applications are using OAuth and the purpose of why they're using it is important. And so it's something that I love to see coming, being in this identity industry for as long as I have. I love where we are now with some of the standards that are making this like easier to develop in a way that now you can look at it and know how things are being granted access, right? And again, that standard way versus, you know, back in the Stone Age when I won't age Justin, but I'll say back in the Stone Age when I started, where it was like, what's this, you know, how was this application, you know, giving access and handling identity? I mean, it was a wild west. You never knew, right? Each application was doing something different. Good luck trying to get a standardized way to manage all of that, right? So moving into, you know, what you know now, what you've seen with the spec, right? What are some of the key things you would tell somebody? Like, here's the things to look out for. Make sure you understand this part about OAuth if you're going on that journey.
One of the most important things to understand when going into OAuth, besides knowing that its nature as a delegation protocol and the fact that you are delegating something, is the nature of different OAuth grants. And the grant is the process by which you delegate that to the software. And there are a lot of different ways to do this, a lot of different standard ways to do this in OAuth 2. And it's really, really tempting to go try and grab the simplest one and just apply that to everything. And then just, you know, figure out the rest from there. This, as you can imagine, leads to a lot of problems because the simplifications and the streamlined portions come with trade-offs. They really are put there for specific purposes, for specific reasons. And the trade-offs for those are not really what you want for most applications. So specifically, a lot of OAuth developers will start using what's called the implicit flow, where you do a redirect to the server and then back. And then that's the only communication is through that front channel, through query parameters in HTTP requests that go through a web browser. Now, the implicit flow was originally invented in order to allow web-based JavaScript applications to communicate, because at the time, the Fetch API or its equivalent didn't give you header access, didn't allow you to make all of these direct post calls and manipulate the HTTP message in the way that we can do it today. So it was really a way to say, okay, if you want to work in this very limited environment, then you can have this, but it comes with all of these security trade-offs. You're leaking parameters, you're leaking state, you're leaking all sorts of things through refer headers and query logs and all sorts of stuff like that. There are a lot of problems with the implicit flow. Now, that's why these days you look at the work that's happening in the OAuth working group for OAuth 2.1. We're actually trying to deprecate and get rid of the implicit flow so that people have a better idea of what their choices are when going into something. So for example, the best advice these days is that for most applications, you want to do what's called the authorization code grant or authorization code flow. The language gets tossed. Right. And along with an extension called PKCE, which is proof key for code exchange. Now, this sounds like a whole lot to remember, but one of the things that OAuth 2.1 is trying to do is give developers just a really simple recipe of start here, do this thing. And if this doesn't fit your needs for some very specific reason, here are some other options. And that's really what I've been telling developers and engineers to do for years. Start with the authorization code flow. And then from there, if you have some other very specific reason to do something else, then yeah, take a look at what that other option might actually look like. But always start with the authorization code flow when you're trying to figure out what the solution is. Because what these different flows really do is that they constrain how the user gets involved in the process and what information gets passed between all of the different parties in the system. And for a security protocol, you can imagine that is a really important thing to be able to do.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I'm glad to hear that, with 2.1, we are looking to kind of deprecate the implicit flow. I know there's been, I've been witness to a lot of heated debates about implicit flow and, how it's used and the challenges with it and the holes that it leaves open. But going into 2.1, can you talk a little bit about some of the things that the working groups for OAuth is looking to enhance or change, going forward with, implementing to the next level of the standard?
Yeah, so one of the things to keep in mind for 2.1 is that we're actually not trying to add anything new. We're really just trying to collect sort of the best practices and the best combinations of things that already exist and encode those as OAuth 2.1, with the idea that if you are, you're building something that supports a bunch of different OAuth 2 options and you're talking, for example, to an OAuth 2.1 server, it'll work because it's using those existing options in sort of ways that are understood to be best practice, the best combinations that you have available. That said, though, the working group is also working on a bunch of other stuff that allows for sort of more advanced and better access and better control of things. So one spec that I'm personally directly involved in is the rich authorization request. So OAuth 2 allows you to have a list of strings that say what you want to access. They're called scopes.
Right.
So you can say, like, I want the profile, I want write access, I want your account information, I want to be able to transfer money, that kind of stuff all gets listed down as a scope. With rich authorization requests, this gets expanded out a bit so that you can now say things like, I want to access a certain amount of money from this particular account for the next 30 minutes, and I want to give the application just that very, very limited window. RAR allows us to describe things using these JSON objects in a much more expressive way than a single scope string would ever allow us to do. But it still has the same type of, semantic wrapping that a scope does, in that this is a chunk of functionality that an API makes available that I want to allow this application to access. Another big thing that we're seeing in the working group right now is focus on sender constraining the access tokens. Now, OAuth 2.0 uses by default what's called a bearer token, which means that it's just a string value. As far as the client application is concerned, it's just a string value that I send over to the server, and then it figures out what to do with it. Right. The client doesn't care what's in the string, but the client also doesn't have to present anything else beyond just the string.
Right.
Which means that anybody that gets a copy of that, suddenly they can use it. Now you can, with this, you can start to see why things like the implicit flow are problematic, because the token value actually gets presented in a URL parameter, which can leak all over the place in spots that you never intended it to. And the authorization code flow avoids that. Now, the OAuth working group knows that there are a lot of use cases where you want a higher level of security than this. You want to make sure that only the party that you gave that token to is allowed to present it. And so there's already an existing specification for how to bind a token to mutually authenticated TLS, which is useful in some scenarios. There's new work that's happening. Well, it's not new. It's entering its final stages of the standardization process. Actually, it's been a few years, called POP. And this is the demonstration for proof of possession of the access token. And the idea here is that you actually create a Jose-based signature around some data of the message, and then you present that alongside the token, which means that when the token shows up, you have just proved that not only do I have the token, but I have access to the key material that I needed in order to make that signature. Now, it's up to the system that you're calling to make sure that the right key was used and the right bits are signed and all of that other stuff. But the system allows you to frame that request so that only the intended presenter has access to all of those pieces.
So what is that? What are the implications then for the client, right? Because that means then, to your point, right, it's not just the bearer token anymore. So that means the client would have to have, access to some of that information to create this to send through it. So
yes.
Yeah.
So it is more complex for the client. And the idea, though, is that the client can use some either library-based or relatively simple signing mechanism to create that signed object and present that very simply alongside the access token. Yeah. There's also been additional work that's proposed. It hasn't been taken up by the working group yet, for using another new spec that I'm involved in called HTTP message signatures. Now, Depop is a really great, very sort of narrow, lightweight way to say, I have a token, I'm sending it with this key signed thing, and that's great. HTTP, however, is really, really, really messy and very, very difficult to wrap with any type of cryptographic anything in the general case, because HTTP messages get chopped up, they get reordered, they get things injected and removed, and all sorts of stuff can happen. So HTTP message signatures defines a general way to actually sign a message. And so the OAuth working group, if the group decides to pick up this proposed work, would be able to take that and apply that to an OAuth access token in much the same way that Depop is happening.
Right.
Now, they solve similar things. Depop is a sort of much narrower, much simpler thing, but, mutual TLS also solves the sender constraint problem, but again, in a different way. So these are all things that would different use cases and different types of environments.
Awesome. Sounds like a lot of good things coming down from the OAuth perspective, and I'm happy to hear that. OAuth it's been amazing watching the adoption of OAuth kind of take place. I know it kind of got off to a little bit of a rocky start, but once we kind of got there, the adoption and what it's been able to do, and the things we've been able to see on top of that, such as, things going on in like open finance, open banking, right? Mm-hmm. OAuth is right in the middle of all that, right? The ability to, kind of get in with those scopes and provide applications the level of detail and delegation that they need. Mm-hmm. So, with that, Justin, we're gonna wrap up, man. Hopefully people have been able to get a lot of good stuff out of this. I do want to take this time to plug ID Pro. Justin and I are both members. For those of you who are looking to become identity practitioners, look, ID Pro is the place to be. I tell people just for the Slack channel alone, because that's where you can hop in and people like me, like Justin, are always kind of hanging out, and a bunch of different experts that love talking about identity stuff. So please go ahead and check that out. But also, Justin, how can people get a hold of you if they got questions, or where would you send them to for specific OAuth?
So for specific OAuth things, I wrote a book. It's called OAuth 2 in Action for Manning Publications. It's available currently. It's actually available in English, Chinese, Korean, and Japanese, which
there we go.
Completely blows my mind because I only wrote the English version, so I can only trust the translators did a good job, but I'm told they did. But yeah, so that book is available as both an ebook and as a physical book. There's a lot of great resources out there for OAuth in general. To get in touch with me, my company homepage has a contact us form. That's really the best way, and that's Bespoke Engineering, bspk.io. And that has information about the kinds of things that I'm working on, and and links from there.
All right, awesome. Well, Justin, thanks again for the time. That's it for Identity Jedi Training. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you guys next month.
Thank you very much.
All right, that's it. That is a wrap. The very first Identity Jedi Show is in the books. Okay, but before we end it, look, we got to explain. Like, I know I was looking a little rough on that first, and I did an Identity Jedi training session. Like, I was on the road. I was in Cali. It was a lot going on. But look, hopefully you got some good information, because Justin Richard was definitely dropping the gems. And if you enjoyed that, you have more questions about OAuth, obviously, you can hit up Justin, as he said, at his website, Bespoke Engineering. That's www.bspk.io. Mr. Justin Richard. Of course, you can go check out his book, the OAuth book, available where all physical books and ebooks are available from. Wherever you go get them, go check it out. And I think that's it. That's it. That's a wrap. That's what we're going to do for this one. We're going to wrap this up. Thanks so much for tuning in. Thanks so much for being a part of this journey. Remember, hit me up at info.onthecorner.us if you want to hear more about what's going on with the Identity Jedi Show, if you want to send in news that you've heard, if you want to be a guest on the show, if you want to give feedback on things that you want to hear on the show, info@onthecorner.us. Or obviously, if we follow each other on LinkedIn, you can hit me up on LinkedIn. If we don't follow each other on LinkedIn, it's okay. You can send a request. I will gladly follow back on LinkedIn, DM, and we can talk about it. Look, until then, you guys be safe. Have a good time. Enjoy life. Remember, it is about the journey and not necessarily the destination. Please make sure you're taking time to remember that. Take some time to smell the roses. Focus on your mental health. Be good out there. Be good to each other. We will see you guys next month. Thanks for tuning in to the Identity Jedi Show.